There are moments in a farming family's life that arrive without warning and demand an answer before you have had adequate time to think. Most of those moments are weather. A storm moving in when the grain is still standing. A late frost when the plants are already up. The kind of emergency that the sky delivers and that farming families have learned, through generations, to respond to without extended deliberation, because deliberation costs time that the situation does not have. The phone call that came to Harold Voss on Wednesday evening in October of 1986 was that kind of moment. Except the clock was not set by the weather. It was set by a bank, by a loan in default, by a deadline that was going to arrive on Friday morning, regardless of anyone's feelings about it. Harold Voss was not a man who panicked. He had farmed his 180 acres in Brimmer County for 22 years. By that October, and in 22 years of farming, you encounter enough genuine emergencies to develop a relationship with emergency that is different from the why relationship most people have with it. You learn that the first minute after the emergency is not the time to act. It is the time to assess. You look at what has happened, and you look at what you have available, and you look at the gap between those two things, and you figure out whether the gap can be closed, and how. Harold did that. He did it at the kitchen table after the phone call, with a piece of paper and a pencil and the specific numbers that his brother had given him. He was the kind of man who thought best with a pencil in his hand and a specific problem in front of him. The kind of problem that could be reduced to arithmetic, because arithmetic was honest, and honest was the only way Harold knew how to proceed. The phone call came on a Wednesday night in October of 1986. At 20 minutes past 9, when the corn was still standing in the field and the harvest had 3 more days of good weather left in it, if the forecast held. Harold Voss was in the kitchen of his farmhouse outside Waverly, Iowa, washing the grease off his hands from an hour spent replacing a belt on his combine header, when the phone rang. He dried his hands on the towel by the sink and picked it up. The voice on the other end was his younger brother, Clarence. And the first thing Harold noticed was that the voice did not sound like Clarence's voice. It sounded like a man who had been trying not to sound like what he was and had run out of the energy to keep trying. Clarence said he had something he needed to tell Harold. He said he should have told him sooner, and he hadn't, and he was sorry about that. Then he told Harold what the situation actually was. It took Harold about 4 minutes to hear the full account. He did not interrupt. He stood in the kitchen with the phone against his ear and listened to his brother explain how far behind the payments on the Voss home place had gotten. How the note with First Federal in Waverly had been in technical default since the previous spring. How the bank had extended twice already and had sent a letter in August that Harold had not known about because Clarence had not shown it to anyone. How the final deadline was Friday morning at 10 o'clock. 37 hours from the moment of. When Clarence finished talking, there was silence on both ends of the phone for a moment. That was all he said. Not that he would fix it, not that everything was going to be all right, not that Clarence shouldn't worry. He said he would call back in the morning, which was a statement that contained neither a promise nor a reassurance, but only the reaffirmation that he had heard what had been said, and that he needed the hours between now and morning to think about it in the way that he needed to think about hard things, which was quietly and with a piece of paper. Clarence said all right and thanked him and said good night. Harold said good night. They hung up. Harold stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hand still on the receiver. He was aware that this was one of the moments in a life that you recognize as significant in the moment rather than in retrospect. One of the moments where the decision you make tonight is going to be the thing you know about yourself for the rest of your life. He was also aware that the decision was already made, that the arithmetic he had not yet done was going to confirm something he already knew, which was that he was going to do everything possible to keep the Werner Voss farm in the family. What the arithmetic would tell him was whether everything possible was enough. He was going to find out. He got a piece of paper and a pencil. The arithmetic that Harold worked through at the kitchen table on Wednesday night and again at 4:30 Thursday morning was the specific, practical kind of arithmetic that farm families use when a real problem has a specific number attached to it and a deadline. It was not abstract. It was not theoretical. It was the arithmetic of what he had and what was needed and whether the gap between those two things could be closed in the available time. But underneath that arithmetic was a different kind of calculation that Harold never put on paper. The calculation that had already been completed before he picked up the pencil. That calculation was about what the Werner Voss farm meant and what it was worth, and what it would cost to keep it in the family versus what it would cost if it were lost. The financial version of that calculation was complicated, because land value and family history and the weight of 3 generations of work are not things that appear in the same units. You cannot directly compare the $19,412 against the value of the connection between the Voss family and that specific ground, because those are measurements of different things, and they do not resolve into a single number. What Harold had instead of that calculation was a certainty, arrived at through the accumulation of everything he knew about his family and his grandfather and the farm and what it meant. That if the money existed and he had it, and the choice was between keeping it and keeping the farm, the choice was not a choice. Which is to say, it was for the moments when something that mattered more than money needed to be preserved. And the money was the tool that could preserve it. He picked up the pencil and did the arithmetic to confirm what he already knew. The arithmetic confirmed it. He went to bed. Harold said he would call Clarence back in the morning. He sat down at the kitchen table after he hung up the phone, and he was there for a long while. His wife Margaret came through from the living room and saw his face and sat down across from him without asking any questions, because she had been married to Harold Voss for 22 years, and she knew what his face looked like when something serious had found him. He told her what Clarence had said. She listened to all of it. Then she asked him what he was thinking. He said he was thinking about their father. To understand what Harold Voss did in the next 36 hours, you have to understand the Voss home place and what it meant, not as a financial asset, but as the kind of thing that farm families carry in their blood when the blood goes back far enough into the same piece of ground. Werner Voss had a quality that his descendants described in different words depending on which generation was describing it, but that was fundamentally the same quality regardless of how it was named. Harold's father Edmund called it steadiness. Harold called it patience. Harold's son called it the long view. What they all meant was the quality of a man who keeps his priorities in the correct order over a very long period of time, who does not let the urgency of the immediate crowd out the importance of the enduring. Werner had expressed this quality in the specific decision to save for 3 years in Chicago before making his move to Iowa. He could have moved sooner. He could have borrowed more and moved with less of his own money. Other men from the same community of German immigrants in Chicago had done exactly that, buying land with minimal down payments on the theory that the land itself would secure the debt, and that the earlier you started farming, the more years of production you accumulated. Some of those men had prospered. Some of them had lost everything in the difficult years of the 1910s and 1920s when commodity prices fell and debt. Service that had seemed manageable at the time of purchase became unmanageable at the time of payment. Werner had watched all of this from the perspective of a man who had waited longer and borrowed less and entered farming with a cushion that the Tortonda that others had not maintained. He had also worked hard. Nobody in the Voss family would have said the key to Werner's success was patience alone. As if patience were a substitute for effort rather than the frame that contained it. He had worked as hard as anyone in Bremer County, and he had been intelligent about what he worked on and when. But underneath the work was the patience, the willingness to build the foundation before raising the structure, to make the savings before making the move, to let the arithmetic of the situation be the guide rather than the desire for the outcome. Edmund had absorbed this from watching his father, and Harold had absorbed it from Edmund, and the specific form it took in Harold's life was the savings account that had been there on the Wednesday night when Clarence called. The farm had been settled by their grandfather, Werner Voss, who had come from Germany in 1903 and had spent 3 years working in Chicago, before he had saved enough to make the move to Iowa that he had planned from the beginning. He had bought 160 acres of Bremer County ground in 1906 for $3,200, which was every dollar he had and several hundred more that he had borrowed from a cousin who had come over 2 years ahead of him. He had broken the ground, built the first structures, established the operation year by year with the steadiness that characterized his family's approach to everything it committed to. Werner had died in 1941 and left the farm to his son Edmund, Harold and Clarence's father, who had farmed it through the difficult years of the 1940s and into the post-war period, and had added 40 acres to the south boundary in 1953 when the neighbor who owned them decided to sell. By the time Edmund handed the operation to Clarence in 1971, there were 200 acres of some of the better ground in Bremer County on that farm, a house that had been rebuilt in 1958, a machine shed and 2 grain bins, and a set of equipment that was older but solid. Harold had not inherited the home place, but he had married Margaret in 1964, and they had bought their own farm 3 miles to the north. 180 acres that Harold had built into a tight, carefully managed operation over 20 years. The arrangement between the brothers had been understood, if not fully discussed. The home place went to Clarence because Clarence would work it. Harold had his own ground. This had always been agreeable between them in the fundamental way that things between brothers can be agreeable when there is mutual respect and no resentment on either side. Harold did not feel that he had been cheated. He had his farm, and he had built it into something solid, and he did not look at the home place across those 3 miles with any feeling that it should have been his. What he looked at it with was the feeling that it was his father's farm, that it was where he had grown up, that Werner Voss had come from Germany with his savings and his borrowed money and his conviction about Iowa ground, and that 3 generations of the family had now been on that land, and that the connection between the Voss family and that specific piece of ground was not a financial relationship, but something older and more permanent than that. Edmund Voss had been aware, in the years before he turned the farm over to Clarence in 1971, that Clarence was a man whose confidence sometimes outpaced his caution. He had mentioned this to Harold once, in the machine shed, while they were working on something together. The particular way that fathers mention their concerns about children when they are no longer children, obliquely and without dwelling on it, trusting the listener to take what was useful from the observation and set aside the rest. Edmund had not been worried about Clarence's ability to farm. Clarence was a capable farmer. He was attentive to the crop and the soil and the machinery in the ways that mattered. What Edmund had observed was that Clarence was susceptible to the kind of thinking that presents a favorable trend as a permanent condition. The kind of thinking that says, because land values have been going up for 5 years, they will continue going up. Because grain prices have been strong, they will continue to be strong. Because the cost of the debt service seems manageable now, it will continue to seem manageable. Edmund had lived through enough agricultural cycles to know that the trend was never permanent, and that the moment when the trend felt most permanent was often the moment when it was closest to reversing. He had watched the boom years of the 1970s begin, and he had said to Harold, not to Clarence, that it reminded him of something his own father, Werner, had described from the boom years before the First World War and the reversal that followed. Harold had filed that observation away. He had not been in a position to prevent what happened to Clarence. A man does not take his brother's financial independence from him in the name of protecting him from his own decisions. You watch, and you say nothing, and you keep your own house in order, and you hope that the decisions work out. And if they do not work out, you are in a position to help, if the help is asked for. The help was asked for. Harold was in a position to provide it. That was the whole of it. Clarence had run the home place with the confidence of a man who had inherited a good thing and the optimism of a man who believed that the agricultural economy of the mid-1970s was going to continue in the direction it was going. He had expanded the equipment. He had taken on some additional rented ground in the years when rental acres were easy to find and commodity prices made the math work. He had borrowed against the rising value of the land. In 1977 and 1978, when bankers were calling farmers and the numbers seemed to support it, he was not the only farmer in Bremer County who had made those decisions. He was not even the most aggressive. Commodity prices came down, and the debt service on the note at First Federal became the number it became. Clarence found himself in the position that tens of thousands of farm families across the Midwest found themselves in during those years, owing more than the math would support and unable to find a path through it that did not involve either selling the farm or losing it. He had not told Harold. This was the part that Harold had to sit with at the kitchen table on Wednesday night. The knowledge that Clarence had been carrying this for the better part of 2 years without saying anything. Harold understood why. The home place had been Clarence's responsibility since 1971. Telling Harold that he had put it at risk was not something Clarence would have found easy, and the longer it went without being said, the harder saying it became. The thing about carrying a secret within a farming family for 2 years is that the carrying of it takes a specific toll that shows up in small ways before it shows up in the large way of a Wednesday night phone call. Harold, thinking back over those 2 years after Clarence told him, could identify moments he had noticed but not understood, times when Clarence had been quieter than his nature required. Times when his end of the conversation at the elevator or the cope had been shorter than usual. Times when he had declined invitations to occasions that Harold knew he would ordinarily have attended. He had attributed these things at the time to the ordinary variations in a person's mood and engagement that any 2-year period contains. Looking back, he understood them differently. They were the behavioral signature of a man carrying something too heavy to carry comfortably, whose energy for ordinary social engagement was being consumed by the weight of what he was not saying. Harold did not fault Clarence for the not saying. He understood it completely. There is a particular kind of pride that farm families carry around the management of their operations. A pride that is inseparable from the identity of what it means to be the person responsible for a piece of ground that has been in the family for multiple generations. To admit to the person most likely to understand the full weight of the failure that you have put that ground at risk is to admit. Something that goes beyond the financial to the personal and the historical. Clarence had not been able to say it until the 37-hour mark. Harold understood why. He would probably have done the same thing in the same situation. Harold did not feel anger at Clarence that night. He felt something more complicated than anger. Something that involved understanding why Clarence had done what he had done, and feeling the weight of the situation that the silence had allowed to develop, and knowing what he was going to do about it, without yet being certain he could. The $19,412 was not a number Harold had liquid. He had savings, careful savings, built over 22 years of tight management on his own farm. But not that number sitting available without consequence. He had a note at the local bank on a piece of equipment he'd bought 2 years earlier that he was current on. He had some grain in the bin that hadn't gone to the elevator yet. He had the corn still standing in his field. He sat at the table and worked the arithmetic. The grain in the bin first. He had approximately 4,000 bushels of corn from the previous season that he had been holding, waiting for a price move that had not materialized. At the price available Thursday morning, $3.20 per bushel, that was $12,800 before the elevator's handling charge. Call it $12,600 net. That left $6,812 short. He had a savings account with just over $8,000 in it. That account was the reserve, the cushion against a bad season, or a broken piece of equipment, or a health situation. The thing that stood between his operation and genuine vulnerability. Touching it meant reducing the cushion to something uncomfortably thin. He looked at the arithmetic for a while. Then he called the savings account against the number, and the arithmetic worked out to within $400 of what was needed. Close enough that the remaining gap could be managed with cash from the checking account without creating a crisis. He made his decision before he went to bed. The night between the phone call and the morning at the elevator was not a sleeping night for Harold. He was up by 4:30, not from any alarm, but from the particular wakefulness of a man whose mind is working on a problem that has a deadline attached to it. He lay in the dark for a while, and then he got up without waking Margaret, and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the paper where he had done the arithmetic the night before. He went through the numbers again. Not because he distrusted the arithmetic from the night before, but because a man making a decision of this magnitude does not rely on arithmetic done once in a stressed condition. He goes through it again in the morning with fresh eyes, looking for errors he might have made. The arithmetic was right. The grain in the bin at $12,600 net. The savings account at $7,200. Total available $19,800. Required $19,412. A margin of $388. He wrote $388 in the margin of the paper and looked at it for a while. It was a thin margin, but it was a real margin. He had verified it twice. He could work inside it. He finished his coffee. He went to the machine shed and checked the combine. Then he drove to town. Paul Schreiber, at the grain elevator, the man who processed the corn sale that Thursday morning, said later that he had known Harold Voss for 20 years and that he had never seen Harold in a hurry. Harold was a man who moved at the pace of what needed doing, which was usually a deliberate and unhurried pace, because he managed his operation well enough that genuine emergencies were rare, and because he understood that rushing things that did not need to be rushed introduced error. On that Thursday morning, Harold was not in a hurry exactly, but there was something different in the quality of his focus that Paul noticed. He was precise in a way that was slightly more precise than usual. He had the grain receipts with him, the documents that established the exact quantity in the bin, the variety, the moisture content, and he had them organized before he walked through the door. To cover his share of the calculation, and he had already verified that the current price covered it. Paul said that the transaction took about 40 minutes from the time Harold walked in to the time the wire transfer was initiated, which was fast by the standards of the elevator office, and that Harold was courteous throughout in the way that he was always courteous, but that he also never deviated from the task at hand to have the kind of conversation about the harvest or the market or the county news that usually accompanied a transaction of that size. Paul didn't ask what the money was for. It was not the elevator's business, and Harold had not offered in. Paul was a man who understood that some transactions had context that was not on offer. He initiated the wire and shook Harold's hand, and Harold thanked him and left. Paul stood at the door of the elevator office for a moment after Harold drove out of the lot. He said he had an instinct that something significant had just happened, not from anything Harold had said, but from the quality of the morning. From the way Harold had come, in the moment the doors opened, and had been organized and focused in a way that said the time available mattered. He was right about that. In the morning, he was at the grain elevator in Waverly when it opened at 7 o'clock. The elevator manager was a man named Paul Schreiber, who had known Harold for 20 years and who understood without being told that a man showing up at the door when the elevator opened and asking to sell 4,000 bushels that morning was a man with a reason. Paul pulled the price and processed the paperwork and had the wire transfer initiated before 8:30. Harold drove from the elevator to the bank where his savings account was. He spoke to the branch manager, a woman named Carol Hennessy, who had handled the account since it was opened. He told her he needed to withdraw $7,200 and that he needed it in certified funds. She asked him if everything was all right. He said everything was going to be all right. She processed the withdrawal. He drove from his bank to First Federal, which was across town and which was the institution holding the note on the Voss home place. He had called ahead and spoken to the loan officer, a man named Gerald Burke, whose voice on the phone had the particular quality of a man who has been through many of these conversations and has learned to keep his affect neutral. Harold told Gerald Burke that he would be in by noon with the funds to bring the Clarence Voss note current. Gerald Burke said he would have the paperwork ready. Harold arrived at First Federal at 11:40. The grain elevator wire had cleared. He presented the certified funds and his own cashier's check and covered the $19,412 in full. Every dollar of it, with 2 hours and 20 minutes left on the Friday morning deadline that Clarence had described on the phone Wednesday night. Gerald Burke processed the transaction with the professional efficiency of a man who had been hoping it would go this direction but had been prepared for the other. He stamped the loan current, generated the documentation that showed the payment received, and shook Harold's hand across the desk. Harold thanked him and drove home. He called Clarence from the kitchen of his own farmhouse. He said the note at First Federal was current and Clarence should go pick up the paperwork when he had a chance. He said the amount he had paid was $19,412 and that Clarence could repay him whenever the repayment was possible. And there was no timeline on it. He said they would not discuss the terms in a formal way because they were brothers, and terms between brothers did not need to be formally discussed. Clarence was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said he didn't know what to say. Harold said he didn't need to say anything. There was another silence. Then Harold told him to get his corn in before the weather changed. Before we get to what happened in the years after, it is worth staying with the moment of the transaction itself. because that moment is the center of the story, and the moments that radiate from it only make sense if you understand what happened in that room at First Federa on Thursday morning. Harold sat across from Gerald Burke, the loan officer, in an office that had the particular quality of institutional spaces where difficult conversations happen regularly, and where the furniture and the lighting are both neutral enough to accommodate any kind of emotion without amplifying it. Gerald Burke was a professional man who had been sitting in loan offices through the farm crisis years of the early 1980s and had processed more distress than any person ought to process regularly. He had learned the particular detachment that allows a man to do his job with integrity in the middle of other people's worst moments. When Harold laid the certified funds and the cashier's check on the desk, Gerald Burke looked at the total for a moment and then looked at Harold. He said he had to say that this was not the outcome he had expected when the notice went out in August. Harold said he supposed it wasn't. Gerald Burke said he had a brother himself, said it the way men sometimes say things that are personal in a professional setting. In a way that is not asking for a response, but is acknowledging a recognition. He processed the transaction and stamped the loan current and generated the paperwork and shook Harold's hand. Harold thanked him and went to his truck. He drove home on the county roads, the same roads he had driven to town on, past the same fields and the same farmsteads. He stopped at the section line where the road ran between his property and the home place. He looked at the home place from the road for a long moment. At the buildings and the machine shed and the grain bins and the fields that Werner had broken out and Edmund had worked and Clarence had nearly lost. Then he drove home and called his brother. Now, the story of what happened in the years after that has two parts, and both of them matter. The first part is what happened to the Voss home place. Clarence took the reprieve that Harold's intervention had created and used it the way a man uses a second chance when he understands what it costs the person who gave it to him. He reduced his operation. He sold the equipment he had bought during the expansion years, the newer tractors and the wide planter, and replaced them with older, less capable, but fully owned machines. He talked to the banker, not Gerald Burke but the branch president, and restructured the remaining note at terms that were sustainable within his reduced and rationalized operation. He worked the home place for 17 more years after 1986. He paid off the restructured note in 1993, 2 years ahead of its term. He handed the farm to his son in 2003 in the condition that Edmund Voss had handed it to him. Not perfectly, not without the marks that 30 years of farming always leaves, but solid and carrying no debt that the next generation had to start by paying off. The Werner Voss farm remained in the Voss family. That was the outcome that Harold had cared about. The second part of the story is what happened to Harold's operation in the year after he paid the $19,412. Margaret did not complain during that year. That deserves to be said directly, because it is easy to tell a story about a man doing something difficult, and to leave out the person who lived alongside the difficulty with him. Margaret had been a full partner in the 22 years of building that had made the savings account possible. She had managed the household on what the farm could support in the years when that was modest and in the years when it was less modest, with the same precision and the same absence of drama that Harold brought to the field side of the operation. She had sat at the kitchen table and listened to Clarence's situation described, and she had understood before Harold finished explaining it what was going to happen next. She had not needed to say anything about it, because there was nothing to say. The decision was the kind of decision that the people that were made unavoidable. And Margaret was not going to perform uncertainty about whether Harold was going to do what Harold was clearly going to do. What she did instead was what she always did in the tight years, which was manage the household budget with the kind of attention that finds $3, where there were only two before, and that stretches the available resources to cover what needed covering without covering what didn't. She knew the difference between a want and a need, which is knowledge that is easy to state and hard to practice, and she practiced it. The year after, October 1986, was a tight year. Neither Harold nor Margaret described it in those terms, to each other or to anyone else. With attention and discipline and the understanding that the resources would come back because the underlying operation was sound, and that a sound operation with a temporarily depleted reserve was a different thing from a depleted operation with no reserve, which was what Clarence had been and what Harold had helped him not to become. It was a hard year. The savings account that had taken 22 years to build to $8,000 was down to $800 after the withdrawal. The harvest of 1986 was adequate but not strong, and the commodity prices that fall did not offer the relief that an above-average crop would have provided. Harold ran his operation through the winter of 1986 and into the spring of 1987 with the kind of careful tightness that he had not had to practice since the early years of his farming, when money was short by nature rather than by circumstance. He did not buy anything that could be repaired. He fixed what broke with whatever was available in the shop before he considered buying parts, and he bought parts before he considered calling anyone for service, and he called for service only when the problem was beyond his skill and the downtime costs more than the service call. He postponed 2 improvements he had been planning. He cut his input costs to the minimum that the soil tests said the ground could sustain without going backward. Margaret kept the household budget with the same precision that she always had, but with tighter parameters that both of them understood without needing to discuss extensively. She was not resentful. She had been at the kitchen table when Harold told her about Clarence's call, and she had watched him do the arithmetic, and she had understood what the arithmetic meant before he had finished writing the numbers. She had not told him not to do it. She had not suggested that the home place was Clarence's problem and not theirs. She had sat with him at the table until the decision was made, and then she had gone to bed. And in the morning she had helped him think through the logistics of where the money would come from. She was a woman who understood what a farm family meant, and what Werner Voss's ground meant, and why Harold was going to do what he was going to do regardless of what it cost them in the following year. She also understood that Harold's operation was solid, enough in its fundamentals to absorb a significant financial shock and recover, which was the only reason the decision had been available to Harold in the first place. An operation with debt service of its own could not have done what Harold did. A farm carrying the kind of load that Clarence had been carrying could not have reached across 3 miles and covered a brother's payment. It was Harold's freedom from debt, his 22 years of careful management and patient saving that made the intervention possible. The savings account that took 22 years to build was spent in one morning, and it was available to be spent because it had been built without anyone else having a prior claim on it. And it is different from the quality of a year when the reserve is gone because something went wrong. When the reserve is gone because something went wrong, the absence of it is a wound. When the reserve is gone because you chose to use it for the thing it was meant for, the absence of it is a different thing. Because you know how to build the reserve back, and you have done it before, and you will do it again. Harold went through the year after 1986 with that quality of purposeful rebuilding. He trimmed the operating costs with the specific attention of a man who knows every line item in his budget and knows which ones can be reduced without consequence, and which ones have a cost that exceeds the saving. He deferred the improvements he had been planning, not indefinitely, but until the savings account was back to a level he was comfortable with. He was more attentive than usual in the harvest of 1987 to minimizing losses in the field, running the combine slightly slower through the sections of the field where the crop was variable, adjusting the header height to catch the down corn rather than passing over it. These were the kinds of adjustments that produced no visible drama. Nobody at the elevator asked Harold why his yield was a half bushel per acre above the county average that year. Nobody at the COPE noticed that his equipment expense line was lower than it had been the previous 2 years. The adjustments were invisible from the outside and significant on the inside, and that was exactly the way Harold preferred to operate. He rebuilt the savings account with the same patience that had built it the first time. It did not go back to its previous level in 1 year. It went back in 3 years, because 3 years was the honest pace of rebuilding a 22-year accumulation from a depleted base. And Harold was not a man who allowed himself to be in a hurry about things that the situation did not actually require hurrying. By the fall of 1987, Harold's savings account was back above $3,000. By 1989, it was back to its previous level. He had not borrowed to replace it. He had rebuilt it the same way he had built it the first time, season by season, with the margin from an operation that cost less than it produced and that he knew well enough to manage at maximum efficiency even in the tight years. The repayment of the loan between the brothers took 7 years to complete. From the first check in the winter of 1988 to the final installment in 1993. Over that period, the two men continued to farm adjacent ground and to have the ordinary relationship of brothers, who see each other regularly and share equipment sometimes and drink coffee at the same diner on Tuesday mornings and talk about the things that farmin' brothers talk about. The loan was present in both of their awareness throughout that period, but was not a regular subject of conversation. Clarence did not provide updates on the running balance unless he was making a payment. Harold did not ask about it. The understanding between them was that the repayment would happen at whatever pace Clarence's operation could sustain it, and that Harold would not manage the relationship around the debt. This was not altruism. It was the appropriate acknowledgement that what Harold had done in October of 1986 was not the kind of thing that could be fully repaid in dollars, because the dollar amount was the mechanism of the thing rather than the thing itself. And the thing itself was the Werner Voss farm continuing in the family. The repayment of the dollars was appropriate and important, and Harold accepted every installment without making any gesture toward declining it. But both men understood that the dollars were not what the relationship was about. What the relationship was about was what it had always been about, which was two men farming the ground that their grandfather had broken out of Iowa Prairie in 1906, and the shared understanding of what that ground represented and what their responsibility to it was. They farmed it for another 15 years together after 1986. Harold on his place, Clarence on the home place, the same adjacent fields that had been in the same families for decades, the same county roads between them, the same elevator in Waverly where the grain went, and the same diner where the coffee was had, and the same conversations about the weather and the crop and what the market was going to do that farmin' brothers have always had in the ordinary run of farming seasons. The ordinary run of farming seasons. That was what the intervention in October of 1986 had preserved. Not drama. Not a rescue story to be told to grandchildren. The ordinary run of farming seasons on the Werner Voss farm. Uninterrupted, continuing forward. The same as it had always been, and the same as it would continue to be for as long as the family stayed with the ground, and the ground stayed with the family. That was the whole point. It always had been. Clarence paid the first portion of the money back in the winter of 1988. A check for $5,000 that he handed to Harold in the machine shed on a Saturday afternoon, and that Harold accepted without ceremony. Over the following 4 years, the remaining $14,000 came back in installments that were sized according to what Clarence's operation could generate. Harold accepted each payment without comment or account of the running balance. He trusted his brother's accounting of it. The full amount was repaid by 1993, the same year Clarence paid off the restructured note at First Federal. Harold deposited the final check and said nothing about the fact that it completed the repayment, because saying nothing about it was the right thing in that context. The acknowledgement that the debt between brothers was not primarily a financial transaction, and that its completion did not require marking in the way that a financial transaction would. They continued to farm adjacent ground in Bremer County for many more years. The two Voss brothers, Harold on his 180 acres to the north, and Clarence on the home place to the south. The land that Werner had bought in 1906 still in the family's hands and still producing the way good Iowa ground produces when it is properly attended. Harold and Clarence's relationship in the years after 1986 had a quality that people who knew them both noticed without knowing exactly what had changed. They had always been close in the way that brothers who farm adjacent ground and share equipment and have coffee at the same diner are close, which is to say, present in each other's lives in a daily and practical way without much of what most people would describe as emotional intimacy. The stress and the financial pressure creating distances that some of those families never fully closed. For Harold and Clarence, the opposite had happened. The phone call and what followed it had created a closeness that had not existed before. Not in the sense of sentimentality or more frequent conversation, but in the sense of a fully acknowledged debt and the particular bond that a fully acknowledged debt creates between people who handle it honestly. Clarence knew what Harold had done and what it had cost him and what it had meant. Harold knew that Clarence knew. On the phone when Harold said the note was current, and in the machine shed when Clarence handed Harold the first repayment check without ceremony, and Harold took it the same way. That was the whole exchange. Two men who had grown up in the same farmhouse, on the same ground, and who now farmed adjacent pieces of it, having conducted the most significant transaction of their adult relationship with a phone call and a check and almost no words. The land was still in the family. That was what both of them knew, and neither needed to say. The men at the elevator in Waverly, and the men at the Cope, and the men who passed through the agricultural conversations of Bremer County during those years knew the outline of what had happened in October of 1986, in the way that important things in farming communities come to be known without being formally announced. The story traveled at the pace that serious things travel in those communities, deliberately and without embellishment, reaching the ears it needed to reach. What those men understood about the story was not primarily about the money. It was not about the $19,412, or the elevator wire, or the certified funds, or the 2 hours and 20 minutes to spare. Those were the mechanics of the thing. What they understood was what the mechanics expressed, which was the kind of family and the kind of farming that produces a man who, when a phone call comes at 9:20 on a Wednesday night, with 37 hours on the clock, sits down at the kitchen table, does the arithmetic, and in the morning does what the arithmetic says is possible. Harold's operation had the savings account because Harold managed carefully. Harold managed carefully, because his grandfather Werner had taught Edmund, and Edmund had taught Harold that the margin between what you take out and what you put in had to stay positive in the long run, or everything else came apart eventually, and that the way you kept the margin positive was not through dramatic decisions, but through the accumulation of small, careful ones over a period of years. That savings account was 22 years of small, careful decisions. It sat in a bank account in Waverley until the Wednesday night in October when it was needed. And then it did the thing it had been built to do without anyone ever having said explicitly that it was being built for any particular purpose. That is what reserve is for. Not for any specific emergency you can name in advance. For the emergency that arrives without introduction on a Wednesday night and has a deadline of Friday morning and requires you to do something that is only possible if you have been managing your affairs in a way that made it possible. Harold Voss had been managing his affairs that way for 22 years, because that was how his father had taught him to manage them, and his grandfather had taught his father, and the chain went back through the Voss family to Werner coming off a boat from Germany, with the kind of clarity about what money needed to do and what it needed not to do that a man develops when he has worked for years to accumulate a specific amount and then trusts that amount with his entire future. Werner had trusted his savings with his entire future. His grandson had trusted his savings with his brother's farm. Both acts of trust had worked out, because both amounts of money had been built by people who understood that the money was not for spending freely but for deploying carefully when the moment required it. The Werner Voss farm is still in the family. The current occupant is Clarence's granddaughter, who grew up hearing this story and who farms the ground with the same care and the same sisyphy that the men in her family's history had brought to it. Because families that farm the same land for 4 generations develop a relationship with the land that does not require explanation. It is in the understanding of the place, in the way the ground responds to certain management, and the way the drainage has always worked in the south field, and the way the wind comes off the north, and what that means for the frost dates. She knows all of this because she grew up on it, and because the men who came before her knew it and passed it along in the practical way that farm knowledge always gets passed along. Not in formal lessons, but in the doing of the work alongside someone who knows it. In the early mornings, in the fields, and the evenings, in the shop, and the kitchen table conversations about what the ground needs, and what the season is doing, and what the next decision is going to be. Margaret outlived Harold by 11 years. She continued to live in the farmhouse on the property that Harold's son now farmed. And she continued to keep accounts the way she had always kept accounts, not of the farm operation any longer, but of her household, with the same precision and the same philosophy that Harold had brought to the farm ledger, and that she had brought to everything adjacent to it for decades. She talked about Harold sometimes to the grandchildren, when they asked about him and about the farm and about what things had been like. She told them about the kitchen table on Wednesday nights when a decision had to be made, about how Harold would get his piece of paper and his pencil and work through the arithmetic until it was right, about how he was never dramatic about difficult things but never pretended they weren't difficult either. She told them about October of 1986, when they were old enough to understand it. She told them about the phone call and the kitchen table and the 4:30 morning and the elevator and the bank and the 2 hours and 20 minutes. She told them that Harold had never said it was hard, not to her and not to anyone else, but that she had known it was hard because she knew him, and because a man who does something hard without saying it is hard is not a man who doesn't feel it, but a man who has decided that saying so is not useful. In 51 years of marriage, was not his intelligence or his patience or his way with the land, though she had loved all of those things. It was his understanding that the things that endure are built before they are needed. That the savings account and the careful management and the years of doing the right thing at every small scale were not separate from the Wednesday night phone call. They were the reason the Wednesday night phone call had a different ending than it might have had. Harold Voss died in 2001, still farming at 74, because he was not the kind of man who stopped when he could still go. Margaret was with him. He had gotten his savings account back to its full complement years before and had never drawn it down again. He left his operation to his son in the condition he had always maintained it, which was the condition of something that had been attended to properly for a long time. His son knew the story of October 1986 because Harold had told it to him once. In the machine shed on a Saturday afternoon, not as a lesson about what to do in a crisis, but as a description of what a savings account is actually for, and why the careful management of it over 22 years had mattered in a way that could not have been planned for in advance. He told his son that the money was not the point of the story. The Werner Voss farm was the point of the story. The money was just what it took to keep it in the family for one more generation. And the reason the money was available was that someone had understood for a long time that someday, somehow, it was going to be needed for something that mattered more than anything it might have been spent on before that moment arrived. The Voss home place in Bremer County, Iowa, is 161 acres in the original tract and 240 with the additions that Edmund made in 1953, and a small parcel that Clarence acquired in 1984 before the worst of his financial difficulties arrived. It sits on ground that Werner Voss bought in 1906 for $3,200. The current price per acre of comparable Bremer County ground is considerably above that. Nobody in the Voss family is likely to sell it. Not because it is not worth selling in the financial sense. It is worth a significant amount. But the Voss family's relationship to that ground is not primarily a financial relationship, and the decisions they make about it are not primarily financial decisions. They are decisions about what it means to be the people who have farmed that land for 4 generations, and what obligation that history creates about what happens to it in the 5th. Werner understood this when he spent 3 years saving in Chicago to be able to buy it without overextending. Edmund understood it when he worked it through the difficult years of the mid-20th century without taking on the debt that would have forced a sale. Harold understood it when he sat at his kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning and verified the arithmetic that said he could keep it in the family for one more generation. 1986, to ensure that the reprieve Harold had given him would not need to be given again. The current occupant, Clarence's granddaughter, understands it in the way that the 4th generation understands things, which is not abstractly or historically, but physically, in the way the ground feels under her boots in different seasons, and the way the drainage has always worked in the south field, and the way the frost always comes to the low corner before it comes to the ridge. She knows the land because she has been on it her whole life, and because the people before her who were on it their whole lives were people who paid attention and passed along what the attention produced. That is the whole inheritance. Not just the acres and the equipment and the buildings. The attention. The way of being in a relationship with a specific piece of ground that produces knowledge over time. The kind of knowledge that cannot be purchased or transferred or acquired any way except through the years of sustained contact that the Voss family has maintained with that land since 1906. His son wrote none of this down. He didn't need to. He had been listening to his father his whole life, with the particular attention that sons of quiet men develop. The attention that comes from knowing that when a quiet man says something, it is worth hearing completely. He heard it completely. The money was not the point. The farm was the point. It always had been. There is something that happens in farming communities when a family has farmed the same ground long enough that the ground itself becomes part of the family's identity in a way that transcends the financial. The land stops being an asset and starts being a relationship, and relationships have obligations that assets do not. Werner Voss understood this. Edmund demonstrated it by working through the difficult post-war years without taking shortcuts that would have improved the short-term position at the expense of the long-term one. Harold demonstrated it on a Thursday morning in October of 1986 by walking into a bank with $19,412 and walking out with 2 hours and 20 minutes to spare. Clarence demonstrated it in a different way in the 17 years after that Thursday morning, by using the second chance Harold had given him to do the kind of farming he should have been doing all along. The farm that came to his son in 2003 was not a damaged thing that had been preserved against the odds. It was a properly managed operation that had been corrected and stabilized, and brought forward in the condition that each Voss generation had understood it was their responsibility to pass along. That is what the phone call was actually about. Not the $19,412, not the 37 hours. Not the 2 hours and 20 minutes to spare, which is the part of the story that people find dramatic, and that is the least important part of it. The important part is Werner coming off the boat in 1903 with a plan. Edmund farming through decades of difficulty without breaking the thing he had inherited. Harold building 22 years of savings on 180 acres 3 miles from his brother's farm. Margaret managing the household through the year after with the same discipline she had always brought to it. Clarence changing his management in the years after 1986 and paying back what he owed. All of it connected. All of it one story running across 4 generations on the same piece of Iowa ground. The phone rang at 9:20 on a Wednesday night in October of 1986. Harold answered it. He sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. In the morning he went to the elevator and then to the bank. He came home with the loan current and 2 hours and 20 minutes to spare. The Werner Voss farm did not leave the family. It has not left the family since, and it will not, as long as the people who carry the name and the ground keep doing what 4 generations of them have understood, which is that the farm is not a financial position. It is a commitment to the ground and to the family and to the next generation who will stand on it and farm it and add their own seasons to the long record of what it means to belong to a specific place. Harold understood that. He had understood it before the phone rang. The phone call just gave him the chance to show it. He showed it. 2 hours and 20 minutes to spare.